Shalom. First and foremost, I want to give all praises, honor, and glory to Yahweh, Bahasham, Yahweh Shai, Bahasham, Recha Kodash. Double honors to the elders and the apostles of Great Millstone, and peace and blessings to the elect. And today we're going to go into the book of Galatians, the 4th chapter. As the Apostle Paul, in this letter, continuing to speak onto the churches in Galatia, right, concerning their at least the reports that he got concerning some of them deviating from the faith and pivoting to trying to be perfect, or trying to prioritize the law above the faith in Yahweh Shai. So this is Galatians 4:1. Now I say that the heir, remember ending off in the 3rd chapter, he mentioned about if we are in Hamashiach, then we are also heirs. So as he says, the heir, as long as he is a child, differeth nothing from a servant, though he be Lord of all. Because while you're still, a child, even though you may be the prince or the heir, you don't really have control or the ability to exercise that lordship just yet, because you're still a child and you still need to be taught. Okay, so even though you are Lord of all, you are nothing, like you differ nothing from a servant, in that it's almost like you don't really have the power to do much because you're still a child. But instead you are, right, but is under tutors and governors until the time appointed of the Father. And the we all know what a tutor is, but let's look into it anyway. So tutor, epitropos, one whose care or honor anything has been instructed, one who has the care and tutelage of children, either where the father is dead, this would be a guardian of minors, or where the father is still alive. So whether the father was dead or alive, you would have the tutor that would be appointed over the child, the heir, to guide him and raise him into things proper, right? So all the skills needed to manage whatever it is that his father, that he would inherit, he would be taught that from a youth on up, right? Whether it's how to, when he's of the appropriate age, how to fight, how to read, write, obviously those basic things, but just morals and proper guidance to raise them up in an upright fashion. And then you have governors, as it says, oikonomos, the manager of household or household affairs. And it says here, especially a steward, manager, superintendent, whether freeborn or as usually the case, or as was usually the case, a freedman or a slave. So sometimes, especially around this time, you would have a slave or a servant, or maybe even a free man, as it says here, who would be set up as, like, their role. If their master saw that they were suitable for it, he would have them serve as a tutor or a governor over his affairs, kind of like Joseph in Potiphar's house. Joseph was bought as a slave, but his role was that of the governor of Potiphar's affairs, to whom the head of the house or proprietor has entrusted the management of his affairs, the care of receipts and expenditures, and the duty of dealing out the proper portion to every servant, and even to the children not yet of age. So they would watch over them, and guide them and raise them up in the right way. And this is often because the father himself couldn't always be there to do that, because if he was like a king, he would have business and affairs to take care of, and maybe he might not always be at home. So he needed somebody that could raise up his son or the heir in the right way. So Paul, uses this comparison to make the point here, right? As he says, even so we, when we were children, were in bondage under the elements of the world. So he likens us when we were, not necessarily children as in, like actual infants, But back when we were in the world, before being introduced to the faith of Yahushai, we were like unto children, not like ignorant. But as it says, we were in bondage under the elements of the world, okay, which are likened unto the deeds of the flesh, right? The things or the path in which we walked in the world without the true knowledge of how to fully, conduct ourselves. But when the fullness of the time was come, meaning at the appropriate time, so the fullness of the time, right? Think of it like if you were filling up a glass of water, or with water, the fullness is as you pour the water, eventually the water, the glass gets full, right? So like if you pouring the water represented time passing, then the fullness of time would be when you reach the brim of the cup, right, at the appropriate time. Or even when you're waiting for something to load and you see the loading bar and it's going and going and going and eventually it hits 100%. So that 100% here would be a time the Lord set to send forth the Yahushai. So from the beginning, as time went on until that part, that was the fullness of it. So at the exact appointed time, the Most High sent forth his son, made of a woman, made under the law. So that's why he sent Yahushai, right, who was born. He came into the world. He had biological parents. And as it says, made under the law, because Yahushai was born into the customs and the laws, and he kept them. Okay, and it was needful for him to do so. As I believe in the book of Hebrews, the Apostle Paul also mentions that having been under the law, right, and having endured the things of the flesh, he is able to, intercede better on our behalf, having known what it's like. But as it says here, made under the law to redeem them that were under the law. So who were they that were under the law that had to be redeemed? Us. Okay. That we might receive the adoption of sons. Because at first we were under bondage to the law. That is, if you keep the law, you have to live. Your life is by the law. So long as you keep it, you live. That is 100%. But we died because none of us could keep it perfectly. So that's likened on to being bond, right? Being in bondage to it. But Yahushai redeemed us through his perfecting of it, but also his sacrifice, that through him we would be able to, as it says, receive the adoption of sons. That is, we would be able to have a way back to the Father. A way back to the Father through Yahushai, right? So an adoption is like the Lord had turned his face away from Israel because of our sins. Our sins separated us from the Lord, right? We became like a degenerate plant onto him. And so Yahushai came on the scene to bridge that gap and adopt us back to the Father. And that's why it mentioned Paul mentioned in the 3rd chapter that we are sons, right? And we are known of the Father. Verse 6, and because ye are sons, God has sent forth the spirit of his son into your hearts. Because he if you are sons of God, then the way he treats his son, he'll treat you. So that's why he sent forth the spirit of his son into your hearts, crying, Abba, Father. And Paul is saying this, noticing or notice that he's pointing out that it was through Yahushai that this spirit that was sent into your hearts, those that the believers in the churches of Galatia that he set up, this was through Yahushai, right? Not through them keeping the law, because that's not what was preached to them, and that's not really what they were doing prior to him coming there. So it says here, wherefore thou art no more a servant, but a son. And if a son, then an heir of God through Hamashiach. So through Yahushai, we were adopted back to the Father and were made sons again. And if we are sons, we are then heirs of God. So we are sons of God to inherit the gift of God. Howbeit then, when ye knew not God, right? So in past times, before you, because remember that these churches here, right, or these Israelites here, were majority Israelites that didn't know they were Israelites. So they grew up not knowing the Most High. They grew up not knowing about Yahushai. They grew up just in the heathenistic customs that they were accustomed to, eating certain foods, dressing a certain way, living a certain kind of lifestyle that was normal to them based on where they grew up. So Paul is saying here, when you didn't know the Most High, because he had Yahweh Bahasham Yahushai had to be introduced to them. He did service, right? Which the word service there goes into to be subservient to or to serve. So it says to be a slave, to do service, a metaphor as in to obey or to submit to. So Paul is saying in times past, you submitted onto them which by nature are no gods. And this is referring to idols, right? They're different because they grew up in different lands, and the people of the lands had their own gods and idols that they served, which a lot of Israelites were in that. And so he's saying here in the time in the past, before the Lord called you through our preaching, you served idols. But now after that ye have known God, or rather are known of God. So now that you have, been called and now the truth of the Lord, or rather you are now known of God. And he says that because the Lord sent them the Spirit to believe. And that means that he knows them. How turn ye again to the weak and beggarly elements? Whereunto ye desire again to be in bondage? So he's saying, prior to coming into the knowledge, right, of God or being known of God, there was a certain way you used to live in which you were subject to, right, the ways of the deeds of the flesh. But now that you are known of God, how is it that you are turning yet again to the weak and beggarly elements, which in this case is not necessarily that they were going back to idol worshiping, but a different form of the deeds of the flesh, which now would be thinking that you could be perfected through the keeping of the law, right? Just like in past times, you thought that doing the right thing was serving idols. But now being swayed by the Judaizers, right? Certain Jews that were going around there pushing circumcision and pushing perfection through the law. These were likened also onto weak and beggarly elements because it would be through the strength of your flesh, right? The actions of the flesh in trying to keep those perfectly, which is impossible. Whereunto you desire again to be in bondage, right? Because then you would be right back to the first place where you started, as opposed to having liberty in Yahushai. And what that means is that you don't have to be perfect so long as you have faith in the Lord. You strive for perfection, but the Lord covers you where he knows you're not going to, get it 100% right. Ye observe days and months and times and years. And this is referring to the the holy days, right? Trying to keep everything perfectly, because now they're introduced to the faith, but now you have some telling them, see, now you got to keep this, you got to do this, you got to do this, you got to keep this holy day here, this, that, and the third. And now you're deviating from focusing solely on the faith to, okay, I got to do this, I got to do that, I got to do this, I got to perfect these things. But that's just bringing you back into bondage, because you're not going to be able to do that perfectly. Okay. I am afraid of you, lest I have bestowed upon you labor in vain. And when Paul is saying this, it's more like I'm afraid for you, right? Lest all the work that I've done to preach onto you and to exhort you and to set you up and to confirm you in the faith was all in vain if you just turn away from it and go and seek another means. Brethren, I beseech you, be as I am, for I am as ye are. Ye have not injured me at all. Okay, so be as I am, meaning live in the liberty of Yahushai, okay, as I do. For I am as ye are, ye have not injured me at all. And I'm going to read this in the NLT as well. It says here, NLT, dear brothers and sisters, I plead with you to live as I do in freedom from these things. For I have become like you Gentiles, free from those laws. You did not mistreat me when I first preached to you. So what he means by become like you Gentiles is not that Paul started, going off into deviating into ways that he wasn't supposed to, but what he means is in times past he was I guess you could say overzealous in the law, the traditions of the Pharisees, and those things, which these were things that the Israelite foreigners that didn't know they were Israelites, they weren't doing, right? Their mindset wasn't, I got to keep the laws perfectly, or I got to strive for perfection in the traditions of the elders or of the Pharisees. Okay. So Paul's saying that he is as them, meaning that in the having the faith in Yahushai, the priority is not keeping those laws and traditions and stuff perfectly. It also doesn't mean abandon it, but what it means is your priority is first perfecting your faith in Yahushai, believing in Yahushai. Okay, so he's saying, live as I am in Yahushai, as the liberty that I have in Yahushai. Ye know how through infirmity of the flesh I preached the gospel unto you at the first. Now, as you read in the letters or the writings of the Apostle Paul, this comes up a couple times where he mentions this infirmity that he had. And, it's not apparent in detail what exactly it was, but based on how he writes and what he says in here, you can draw the inference, right? Or you can infer that this had to do with, some physical hindrance that he had, all right, with his eyes, because he mentions this. So, and this likely was either something visible on him or very noticeable about him. So as he says here, and my temptation, which was in my flesh, so that infirmity that he had, ye despise not, nor rejected. So you didn't reject him or despise him or as he's going to say, but receive me as an angel of God, even as Yahushua HaMashiach. What that means is they didn't despise or look down upon Paul or show him any less reverence because of his physical infirmity, but rather they received him as an authority that was set up by the Lord. All right, just like you would receive an angel or Yahushua, right, as an authority who you would be obedient to. Where is then the blessedness ye spake of? So he's saying, remembering those times, you were very glad, right, and joyous in spirit at that beginning when I first came onto you and preached these things onto you. So where is that now? That so soon after I left, you're quickly turning aside from the things that you were taught. For I bear you record that if it had been possible, like he's saying, I remember this, like your joy and gladness for receiving me was so much that if it was possible, ye would have plucked out your own eyes and have given them to me. See, and this hints at whatever infirmity he had in the flesh being related to his eyes. Okay, like I said, whether it's something that was visible, you could see it on him, or it was noticeable enough. But he's saying like they were so willing that they would have, if they could, given him their own eyes as to rid him of that infirmity of the flesh. Am I therefore become your enemy because I tell you the truth? So as he's saying here, like he's speaking sharply to them in certain parts of this letter because he is trying to, out of fear of not losing them in the faith, he is trying to correct them, right? In expressly explaining to them the importance of the faith in Yahushua and the superiority of that above anything else. But as he's saying here, have I now become your enemy because I'm telling you the truth? They zealously affect you, but not well. Yea, they would exclude you, that ye might affect them. So here he's referring to those that came there trying to sway them or trying to get them to follow after the teachings that these Jews that went there were teaching. And I'll read this in the NIV as well, as it says here. those people are zealous to win you over. Those that were teaching, perfection through the law and of Moses and circumcision. And yeah, it's good to have faith, but you if you want to be saved, you read Acts the 15th chapter, the first few verses. It's the same rhetoric or the same thing that they were pushing. So, and they weren't, and that was in Antioch, but clearly it wasn't the only place they went around pushing that. But this is very dangerous, especially for, see, those that were newly coming in, right, into the faith, they could easily have their faith overthrown by things like that. But see, when they took that to Antioch, Paul and Barnabas, they weren't having that because they were more established in the faith. So that's why they went back and forth with them and went all the way to Jerusalem and had that council. But Paul feared that a place where, they were newly converted, that they weren't keeping these customs from their youth on up, and they were just being built up. If men like this went there and started teaching these things to them, it could very well overthrow that faith they had. When first they had to be built up and strengthened in their faith in Yahushua, first and foremost, and the rest they would pick up along the way. So as he says here, those people are zealous to win you over, but for no good. What they want is to alienate you from us, so that you may have zeal for them. See? And that's basically what they were doing, and that's why Paul called them false brethren, brought in unawares. But it is good to be zealously affected always in a good thing. So he's saying, but if it comes to doing the right thing, having that zeal for it is good, and it's actually good to do that all the time, and not only when I am present with you. So don't do that. Don't do it only when I'm there. Oh, being one way and having the zeal of righteousness and following after it only when I'm there, and then when I'm gone, you're so quick to turn about from it. My little children, of whom I travail in birth again, until Hamashiach be formed in you. And here he's using the example of like a woman that gives birth, right? He's saying here, like, the first time I came there and taught you and established you, it was like me birthing you, right? You were like my children in Yahushua for the first time. But now I have to go through those pains of birthing you again, okay, continually until Yahushua is formed in you, where I don't need to keep doing that. Because what the reports I'm hearing is showing me that it's needful for me to have to do that constantly, or again, to make sure that you are being solidified in the faith and not so soon turned away. I desire to be present with you now. So I wish I was there with you now, and to change my voice, right? Because he was now, at least from the way he was speaking, as he says, for I stand in doubt of you, right? He was concerned, but also rebuking them. And he's saying, I wish I was there with you now to be able to exhort you and correct those of you that are, falling into the wrong path. Because now I'm in doubt of your faith. If you're truly, gonna maintain the faith, and that all this labor is not in vain. Tell me, ye that desire to be under the law, do ye not hear the law? So he's like, okay, since you, you're so desirous to be on the law, are you not aware of the things that are in the law? And now as the subheading says, bond and free. So what Paul's going to do here, he's like, okay, you want to deal with the law. Hey, you want to deal with the law. Guess what? In the law, I'm going to use the things in because the law here concerning the Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible, contains the story of where he's going to pull this record or account from to make a point. He's saying, look, I'm going to use an account that was in the law, in the scriptures of old, to prove to you or to show you and make that point about the superiority of the liberty in Yahushua above the bondage of the law. So, continuing on, verse 22, for it is written that Abraham had 2 sons, the one by a bondmaid and the other by a free woman. And when you go into the book of Genesis, that account is in there. right? The the two sons are Ishmael and Isaac, and Ishmael was by the bondmaid, which was Hagar, and Isaac was by the free woman, which was Sarah. But he who was of the bondwoman was born after the flesh, but he of the free woman by promise, right? Because with Hagar, which was the bondwoman who birthed Ishmael onto Abraham, that was after the flesh, right? That was of a normal, sort of interaction. Sarah was barren, so she gave her handmaid Hagar onto Abraham. He laid with her after the custom of men and women, and she got pregnant and she had a child. But concerning Isaac's birth, which was of the free woman, that was by promise, right? Because the Lord said, look, I'm going to give you an heir, right? It's going to, your inherit, what I've promised you is going to go to your seed. But when Abraham first asked, well, Lord, should I just, because I'm at the point where I'm old, I'm way too old. Sarah's also old. And all I have is a servant that was born in my house to give my inheritance to. He said, no, it's going to be of your seed. And then he had Ishmael. And then he thought, okay, well, I've had Ishmael. He said, no, it's going to be of Sarah. Okay. And then you had the three angels that came there. And when they told Abraham that he was going to have that child at the time of life, Sarah laughed, right? She laughed in her heart. And then the angel pressed her about it and she tried to lie about it. But long story short, that seed of the promise was Isaac. Okay, so he's making a distinction here, right? You have the bondwoman, Hagar, her son, Ishmael. Free woman, Sarah, her son by promise, Isaac. Which things, and so he's now going to show the symbolism, okay, behind these events that took place. So as he says, which things are an allegory, he's not saying that the events themselves are an allegory, but he's saying the history of this can symbolize, right, the point that he's about to make here. For these are the two covenants, the one from the Mount Sinai, which gendereth to bondage, which is Hagar or Hagar. She's the bondwoman. So in the NLT, it says, these two women serve as an illustration of God's two covenants. The first woman, Hagar, represents Mount Sinai, where people received the law that enslaved them. That's what it means by gendereth to bondage, because the child of a bondwoman would be bond as well. So Hagar representing Mount Sinai, where we got the laws, it was like birthing us into bondage, because we received the laws, but we became under the curse of the law, right? We became under bondage to it, where you would either live by it or you would die. Verse 25, for this Hagar or Hagar is Mount Sinai in Arabia, and answereth to Jerusalem, which now is, and is in bondage with her children. Okay, and let's look up that word answereth. All right, it says to stand or march in the same row or file, to stand over against, to be parallel with, to answer to resemble. So once of a type in the Old Testament, which refers to, okay, all right, that's good enough. So it says here, figuratively, to correspond to. Okay, it says here in the Thayer's Greek lexicon, to stand or march in the same row with, to stand over against, to be parallel with. If something is parallel with you, it's like you're both going in the same direction. You're not touching, but you're like in the same direction. So it says here, or better yet, like even if you have like traffic lanes, right? When you're driving on the road, lane 1 and lane 2 are parallel to each other. Tropically, it says here to answer to or resemble. Okay, there's that word right there, to resemble. So going back to Galatians 4 and verse 25, he's saying here that for this Hagar is Mount Sinai in Arabia, and resembles Jerusalem, which now is, and is in bondage with her children. Because the Jerusalem at the time were pushing, right, the perfection of the law, right, the way of Moses, the Mosaic laws, and all of those things, which Paul likens onto being under bondage, okay, with her children. So let's see here. It says here, NIV, now Hagar stands for Mount Sinai in Arabia and corresponds to the present city of Jerusalem because she is in slavery with her children. Why? Because what was being pushed at Jerusalem at the time? By the Pharisees and the chief priests and the scribes, the law, right? Which represented in Paul's allegory here, or his illustration here, Hagar, or bondage. But Jerusalem, which is above, so he likens Hagar and Mount Sinai and the covenant and the law to be like the present Jerusalem, right? The present day Jerusalem, where they are under bondage to the law. But the Jerusalem which is above, the heavenly Jerusalem, is free, because that is likened onto the liberty in Yahushua, okay, which is the mother of us all. And let's also look at this in another translation. I'll read the NIV first. It says, but the Jerusalem that is above is free, and she is our mother. That's like having the nation of Israel and then having the Israel of God. NLT says, but the other woman, Sarah, represents the heavenly Jerusalem. She is a free woman, and she is our mother. Okay, but as it says, which is the mother of us all, which also goes back to the, as you would call, the motherland, right? Which we know also goes back to that region of Jerusalem. So verse 27, for it is written, so Paul has made a distinction here, right? You had Hagar, Sarah, present day Jerusalem under the bondage of the law, and the heavenly Jerusalem, which came by faith and liberty in Yahushua. Verse 27, for it is written, rejoice, thou barren that bearest not. Break forth and cry, thou that travailest not. And when you travail, a travail is like going through childbirth, right? But if you're barren, you're not getting pregnant, you're not travailing, you're not going through childbirth. For the desolate hath many more children than she which hath an husband, right? And that's, I believe that's in the book of Isaiah. Let's see if it shows up. Yeah, Isaiah 54. Sing, O barren, thou that didst not bear, break forth into singing and cry aloud, thou that didst not travail with child. For more are the children of the desolate than the children of the married wife, saith the Lord. So Paul also quotes this, but he is making this, once again, that reference back to Sarah, which was barren at first, right? But guess what? Of her, just like Abraham became a father of a multitude, of her came Isaac, of Isaac came Jacob, of Jacob came the 12 tribes. And let's let me see how the other. Okay, so here, all right, it's mainly him just quoting that in Isaiah. But then as he says here, verse 28, now we brethren, as Isaac was, are the children of promise. But as then he that was born after the flesh. So what he has done here is, right, he has made a separation to say, look, we are likened unto Isaac, born of the free woman, of the promise, okay, which aligns to Paul's point here, representing the liberty in, or the grace in Yahushua. And then he likens those that are gun-ho for keeping the laws perfectly and pushing salvation or perfection or righteousness through circumcision and through the laws onto the bondwoman, okay, of Hagar. So he's making that distinction here using this account of history in Israel. And now, having said that, he's saying here, just like back then, dealing with the son of the free woman, the child of the promise being Isaac, and Ishmael, the son of the bond woman, as he says in verse 29, but as then he that was born after the flesh, which is Ishmael, persecuted him that was born after the spirit, which is Isaac. even so it is now. So he's saying if we that are reborn in the spirit, that are believing in Yahweh Shai, right, that have the faith of Yahweh Shai, are likened unto Isaac, and those that are in bondage under the law are likened unto Ishmael. Guess what? In the past, just as Ishmael persecuted Isaac, so they that are under bondage to the law persecute us that are under bondage to that are free through the spirit, or free through the liberty in Yahweh Shai. And the persecution he's talking about here, he's really, if you go back to it in Genesis, this was when Ishmael was mocking Isaac, and Sarah did not take kindly to that. This is Genesis 21:9. And Sarah saw the son of Hagar the Egyptian, which she had born unto Abraham, mocking, right? And she was mocking Isaac. He was mocking Isaac, and she did not like that. And let's go into that word mocking, because he was older than Isaac, right? It says here to sport, to play, to make sport, to toy with, right? So in this case, it even says here in merriment or scorn. So it wasn't like they were just, it's like if you confront him, you say, oh, I was just playing with him, right? But, maybe he made Isaac cry, or he said something, or whatever the case was, right? Some light form of bullying, or, whatever it is. But, Sarah was not playing around with that. She heard that. She said, yo, get this bondmaid and her child out of here immediately. So that's what Paul's referring to here about the he that was born of the flesh persecuting him that was born after the spirit, and likening it onto their situation of like what was happening there to the churches in Galatia, as those that came in there tried to bring them under bondage of the law. And that was also, like, it's kind of like what Paul's explaining here is also the matter that was being debated in the Jerusalem Council about bringing the those Israelites that had come to the faith of being Israelites and believing in Yahweh Shai, but trying to bring them under the bondage of the law, which even you yourselves couldn't keep perfectly, who were raised in the law. Verse 30, nevertheless, what saith the scripture? So he's saying, so what happened when this was the case in verse 29? Cast out the bondwoman and her son, for the son of the bondwoman shall not be heir with the son of the free woman. So then, and that's what happened, right? Abraham didn't like it at first, but the Lord told him, it's okay. You know what? Just pack her bags, let her leave. I'm going to give him, Ishmael, that is, his blessing. But, listen to what Sarah is saying here. Verse 31, so then, brethren, we are not children of the bondwoman, but of the free. So he has made the point here to say that just like in the scriptures, what was the outcome between the bond and the free? The bond was cast out and the free remained. So if we are the free, we're children of the free woman and not the bondwoman, what do we ought to do? Prioritize the faith, the liberty, and the grace in Yahweh Shai, and not turn to try and go under bondage to what they're pushing, or what those that came there to try and bring them under bondage to the law were pushing. Now, once again, like I mentioned before, Paul is not saying here completely abandon the law, because if that was the case, then in the council that at Jerusalem, they were still parts of the law that they told him to keep. But what he was saying is, you're not going to be made righteous through the law. So don't prioritize that over the actual way you would be made righteous, which is through faith in Yahweh Shai. Because ultimately, through faith in Yahweh Shai, you would eventually start to keep more laws than you did before, when you didn't even know Yahweh Shai. But that's the priority, is first that faith and belief in Yahweh Shai. So this brings us to the end of the book of Galatians, the 4th chapter. Lord willing, that was edifying to the elect. In closing, I want to give all praises, honor, and glory to Yahweh, Bahasham, Yahweh Shai, Bahasham, Racha Kodash. Until next time, Shalom.